This episode of the History Guy is brought to you by Geology, powered by facts, not fads.
Quick, what is the most widely used drug in the world? The answer probably came to you fairly quickly. Aspirin. That's no surprise. The world will consume some 40,000 tons of aspirin just this year. While it was the subject of what has been described as the world's first clinical trial, it is still one of the world's most studied drugs. Its history is both surprisingly recent and surprisingly ancient. Its uses are vast and varied, but its risks are probably more than some people understand. Its history is wrapped up in not just pharmacology and science, but also politics and war. Heck, in addition to being the world's most widely used drug, aspirin is quite possibly the most interesting drug in history. I have to admit, when my business manager Carolyn said someone named Geology wanted to sponsor an episode, I thought, rocks? But no, Geolgie, award-winning skin, hair, and body products. And then I thought, rocks makes more sense. I'm a 60-year-old dude. I don't do skincare. But then I thought, I'm a 60-year-old dude. Maybe it is about time I started taking care of my skin. I mean, after all, just because I'm 6 decades old doesn't mean I have to look like a pirate.
It's crazy easy. You just go to geology.com, take a simple test, and they recommend simple and effective skincare and hair care routines customized for you. And it's shipped directly to your door. It's good stuff, powered by facts, not fads. There's no fillers or fluff. It'll help you fight acne or reduce oiliness or prevent wrinkles and combat those darker, puffy under eyes. The scents are things like bergamot and juniper, scents common to shaving creams. Pleasant yet still manly because, still a dude. You know it is effective because Geology has gotten over 10,000 five-star reviews. My routine is simple. Use a face wash in the morning, followed by a morning cream with some sunblock. Use a body wash in the shower, then at night wash my face again. I'm getting on, so I have an under eye cream for those dark circles, followed by a night cream that moisturizes and has some retinol. Your youth may be history, but your skin doesn't have to be.
Thank you, Geology, for taking care of my skin and sponsoring this episode of The History Guy. Use my link and code that are in the description box and the pinned comment. You'll get 70% off your personalized skincare trial box and 50% off any add-ons.
You might well have heard that aspirin was actually discovered by Hippocrates, perhaps history's most famous physician and namesake of the famous doctor's oath. Hippocrates lived sometime around the 4th or 5th century BC in the time of Pericles. It isn't exactly clear what can be attributed to him, in that the work called the Hippocratic Corpus, a collection of some 60 different medical texts by the ancient Greeks, was likely actually the work of many authors, and no single piece is provably connected to Hippocrates, although he is generally credited with moving the study of medicine from the realms of theology and philosophy to practical study. He is often referred to as the father of medicine. Hence, it is not surprising that he is often credited with the discovery that willow bark, which contains a compound called salicylic acid, was an analgesic and anti-inflammatory that he prescribed for pain in childbirth. But in a 2020 article in the journal The Conversation, aptly titled, "What You Know About the History of Aspirin is Probably Wrong," Philippa Martyr of the School of Biomedical Sciences at the University of Western Australia notes that works attributed to Hippocrates only mention willow one time, by burning its leaves to make smoke for fumigating the uterus to get rid of a miscarried pregnancy. But Hippocrates is not the only ancient source to mention willow bark. Doctors Valentine Fuster and Joseph M. Sweeney note the Ebers Papyrus in the journal Circulation in February 2011. Purchased in 1862 by Egyptologist Edwin Smith in a street market in Luxor for £12, the Ebers Papyrus is considered to be one of the most comprehensive ancient medical papyruses ever recovered. Dating back to 1534 BC, Sweeney and Fuster write, the most important plant species mentioned is terret, or salix, known today as willow. The Ebers Papyrus describes the use of this ubiquitous tree, which grew in most parts of the prehistoric world, as either a general-purpose tonic or an anti-inflammatory pain reliever for nonspecific aches and pains. By 216 AD, through trade, military contracts, and neighboring coastal city communications, willow had become a commonly used remedy across the civilized world, and its use might even predate the Egyptians. Research scientist Daniel Goldman explained in an edition of the Smithsonian Institute's Distillation magazine that the first recorded use of salicylates dates back about 4,000 years to the Sumerians, who noted the pain remedies of the willow tree on early clay tablets. Ancient civilizations in Mesopotamia used the extract from willow trees to treat fever, pain, and inflammation. Both Chinese and Greek civilizations employed willow bark for medical use more than 2,000 years ago, and the Chinese also used poplar bark and willow shoots to treat rheumatic fever, colds, hemorrhages, and goiter. But all those ancient origin stories raise important questions. Martin notes that willow bark and leaves were used in some ancient medicines. However, she writes they were often used externally rather than swallowed. Because ancient weights and measures are confusing and sometimes missing altogether in recipes, it's hard to tell whether there was enough salicin in the ancient recipe to make a difference. In fact, the type of willow tree that Hippocrates seems to have mentioned doesn't have enough concentration of salicylic acid to be effective. And to achieve that concentration by, say, chewing the bark or brewing it in an herbal tea, the concoction would have caused an upset stomach long before its analgesic and anti inflammatory properties could be realized. Many ancient remedies for willow bark seem to have little to do with the salicylic acid in its bark. For example, she writes that the Roman physician Dioscorides suggested rubbing burned willow bark soaked in vinegar on corns and calluses to remove them. She writes salicin is used today to treat corns and warts, but that doesn't mean that Dioscorides' recipe worked because of the salicin. Vinegar is acidic and is said to soften corns on its own. This isn't to say that salicylic acid in willow bark didn't have any effect, but she writes the ancient history of aspirin has a lot of holes in it. More ominously, the story of willow bark is what she describes as a good example of how myths build up around ancient medicines. These myths can be more marketing than reality. She writes, modern medicine likes a respectable family tree. It helps give today's manufactured products a good pedigree. But if the history you've heard isn't quite history, then when does the history of aspirin begin? Even to the extent that the ancient world recognized the medicinal properties of willow bark, that knowledge seems to have been forgotten. Anthony Daniels of the London Morning Telegraph wrote in 2004, before the advent of aspirin, there was no real analgesics except for opium. But opium was often a cure that was worse than the disease. Daniels continues, the lack of alternatives, at a time when people suffered far more illness and injury than they do now, probably accounts for their frequent overindulgence in both alcohol and opium. But the painkiller revolution began around 1758 in the quaint Cotswold village of Chipping Norton. There, a country vicar named Edward Stone made a discovery. He chewed, just out of curiosity, a bit of willow bark and found it to be very bitter. That intrigued him. The bark of the Peruvian cinchona tree had been found to have medicinal purposes, and since the 17th century, cinchona bark had been used to make quinine, a treatment for malaria. Might willow bark have similar properties? He collected and dried the bark and then ground it to powder. He then used it, taking a dose every few hours to treat fever. Marta writes, drying the bark would have concentrated the salicin, making its effect stronger. Finding success in reducing fever, he eventually tried the cure on some 50 parishioners suffering from intermittent fever, finding success. And so he wrote to the Right Honourable George, Earl of Macclesfield, President of the Royal Society. My lord, among the many useful discoveries which this age hath made, there are very few which better deserve the attention of the public than that what I am going to lay before your lordship. There is a bark of an English tree which I found by experience to be a powerful astringent and very effective in curing ague and intermittent disorders. The Society published the results in 1861 under the title Detailing 5 Years of Experiments on the Use of Dried Powdered Willow Bark in Curing Fevers. This was, some argue, the first real clinical trial of a pharmaceutical. Still, the finding was important. Author Diarmaid Jeffreys wrote in his 2005 book Aspirin, The Remarkable Story of a Wonder Drug. The agues were a significant medical problem in parts of Britain, sometimes fatal, always unpleasant, striking indiscriminately without deference to rank or fortune. But Stone did not fully understand what he had found. He generally thought the willow bark as an alternative to quinine, one with a less expensive domestic source, but as Jeffreys explains, the two remedies are quite different. Quinine attacks the parasite that causes malaria, whereas what Stone had found was a therapeutic remedy for malaria's symptoms. That was important. Willow bark was not actually an effective treatment for malaria. The Confederacy found that out during the American Civil War, when, having largely been cut off from a supply of quinine by the federal blockade, they attempted to use willow bark as an alternative, finding little success. But Jeffreys notes the symptoms of malaria, feverishness, high temperature, aching limbs, and headaches can be associated with a number of conditions. Thus, Stone's dried and ground willow bark had applications beyond ague. But adoption was slow, earning, Jeffreys writes, only a few converts. It was really the dynamics of the 19th century that would turn Stone's bark into a wonder drug. It was in that century that the new science of pharmacology began to study the chemistry of various remedies, and willow bark, then little more than an occasional replacement for quinine, garnered attention. The process, what Jeffries calls a complex puzzle, came in many steps. Italian scientists Brunatelli and Fontana extracted impure crystals from the willow bark in 1826. German pharmacologist John Buchner refined the yellow crystals, and Jeffries writes obtained a tiny amount of substance that he called salicin, named after salix, the Latin name for the willow tree. Frenchman Henri Leroux was able to extract a larger amount of salicylin crystals in 1829, and Italian Raphael Puria was able to refine a more potent acid from the crystals, which he called salicylic acid. Meanwhile, Swiss apothecary John Pagenstecker was studying the spirea plant, commonly called meadowsweet flower, which he believed offered a remedy for toothache, boiling down the flower into a sweet-smelling liquid that he used to treat pain. He published a little-noticed article in a Swiss journal in 1830 that was found by German chemist Carl Jakob Loeg. Loeg was able to isolate an acid in the substance, which he found was an effective remedy for fever and pain. He called the substance spizira after the spirea plant. Its name derived from the Greek spiria, meaning coil or spire, only to discover when Paria's work was published that he had found the same substance that had already been extracted from willow bark, salicylic acid. In 1876, Scottish physician Thomas McLaughlin determined salicin to be an effective treatment for acute rheumatism. But there was an issue. Science writer Kat Eschner explained in Smithsonian Magazine in 2017. Salicylic acid causes gastrointestinal irritation, meaning it wasn't good for long-term use, and some people couldn't take it at all. That's where Felix Hoffmann comes in. His father suffered from rheumatism, but salicylic acid caused him to vomit. Hoffmann, working for German pharmaceutical company Bayer, looked for a solution and found one by altering the acid's structure. He did this through a process known as acetylation. In the end, acetylsalicylic acid didn't irritate digestion the way that salicylic acid did. There is, however, controversy over what role Hoffmann played as the head of Bayer's pharmaceutical division. Arthur Eichengren and head of its clinical trials division, Heinrich Dresser, also were part of the process of developing aspirin, as they were with several other drugs. Science author Gerald Clark writes on the website PharmaIQ in 2013. Since the acid exists as acetylsalicylic acid, Hoffmann added an A for acetyl to the front of spizira, and it was patented as aspirin. There was difficulty with the patent, since salicylic acid had already been discovered. Denied a patent in Germany, aspirin was patented in Britain and the US. Both patents were challenged, with the British patent overturned. Bayer did, however, own the trademark name aspirin, where other products used the name ASA for acetylsalicylic acid. Originally sold as a white powder to hospitals, Bayer developed a pill form by 1900. With the patent challenges, Bayer worked hard to associate the drug with Bayer, with its cross logo on the bottles, as well as the name aspirin with the drug. But Bayer's hold was largely broken by the Great War, and the company was cut off from its foreign markets. Britain voided its trademark on the aspirin name, and the company was involved in the production of poison gas. Bayer held on to their ownership in the United States, and a considerable scandal arose when German espionage plans were left in a briefcase in the New York City subway, detailing a plot by Bayer to dominate the supply of phenol used to make aspirin, but also munitions. The idea was to limit American munitions production that could be sold to help the Entente powers. There were no legal charges, but the Bayer reputation was damaged. When America did enter the war, its assets and trademarks were confiscated and auctioned off. The trademark was obtained by the Sterling Products Company. Bayer didn't reacquire the rights to the name again in the United States until 1994. But the world wasn't just facing the war, but the great pandemic of 1918, an influenza that was associated with high fevers. The dosage was not well understood at the time, and doctors, seeing the risks from the fever, prescribed high doses of aspirin, which can cause pulmonary edema and bleeding. These symptoms might have been masked by the symptoms of the flu, and although the extent is unknown, it is theorized that the improper use of aspirin may have greatly added to the mortality of the pandemic. Over time, aspirin faced increasing competition from alternatives such as ibuprofen, discovered in 1961, and acetaminophen, which, while first synthesized in 1878, didn't find widespread acceptance until the 1950s. By the mid-century, aspirin was still the undisputed king among painkillers and one of the most used drugs in the world. Still surprisingly, it was unclear exactly how aspirin worked. The mechanism was finally discovered by British pharmacologist John Vane, working with pharmacology graduate student Priscilla Piper, determining that aspirin inhibits a particular enzyme, stopping the production of a certain natural substance that causes fever, pain, and swelling. Vane received a Nobel Prize for the discovery in 1982. The discovery also found that the same mechanism that reduces pain and inflammation also inhibited blood clots. These antithrombotic effects have led to the use of aspirin to treat and prevent both myocardial infarction, or heart attacks, and strokes. As many as 29 million Americans now take a daily regimen of aspirin.
The world's most widely used drug is today used to treat more than 50 different symptoms and even to inhibit the growth of 11 kinds of cancer. It has so many applications that despite its age, it is still being constantly studied. Some 3,500 articles will be published about aspirin in medical journals each year. Even its non-aspirin form, salicylic acid, is found common use as a gel that's used as an exfoliant and to prevent acne. Despite its many benefits, however, there are certain risks that come with aspirin, and it's in so many products, it's likely that you're getting doses of aspirin without even knowing it. And so, damn it, Jim, I'm a historian, not a doctor. Don't take pharmaceutical advice from me. Consult your physician. But aspirin's history means that the world's most widely used medicine is as interesting as it is effective. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.